Welcome, and this is a presentation on literature and liberation, a look at Black queer rhetoric and the fight for Black liberation, presented by Luke Adams, Brigit Sampson, and Esin Ural.
So, just to give a little um, background to what we're about to start looking at, we're going to do our introduction, go over our thesis and research questions that formulated our research, and then we will go through the theoretical concepts and historical context of the that back the research, and then we'll go into our main analysis and pull it all together.
All right, so our thesis for the project is that radical literature serves as a means for navigating liberation movements, and that this is visible in the Black queer liberation movement, as well as the larger picture of the Black radical tradition.
And then we go into our research questions. So we have three main ones. Why were these conversations that were had in magazines and alternative published media important to have in Black queer spaces? How did leaders within the civil rights movement address the notion of the Black queer liberation movement? What was said? And finally, how does radical imagination and dreaming play a role in the Black queer liberation movement?
So the theoretical concepts that are being used to really analyze the research are, of course, the Black radical tradition from Robin Kelly, the Black radical feminism, intersectionality, identity politics, and white supremacist capitalist patriarchy.
So, in order to just jump right into that, we're going to start with the Black radical tradition. This term was outlined originally by the scholar Cedric Robinson and then later detailed further by Robin D.G. Kelly, who's visible on the top photo. There's no neat quote from either that will give us a perfect definition, but it's basically the long-running tradition of Black writers, activists, and artists engaged in the creation of a new world. Not just, representational politics, but something actually radical and transformative, bringing a new world out into the current one. This movement was inspired but not quite subordinate to French surrealism. Uh, for example, many writers like M. Césaire and Suzanne Césaire were very clued into that kind of writing, but that is not to say that the Black radical tradition and the ideas surrounding it are their entire being to French surrealism, because there's a ton of different outlets that are created. For example, we had all sorts of artists, scholars coming into this, musicians, for example, like in jazz called like Sun Ra and John Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders, who are transcendent, psychedelic, actively creating new boundaries and new possibilities. Uh, Many poets too, people like Langston Hughes, people who are contributing to a body of work that is not just representational but actually liberatory.
So next we're going to move on to the terms of intersectionality and identity. Hold on, my screen is blocking my thing. What was the identity? Sorry, hold on 1 second. Can't figure out how to move this thing. Does anybody know how to move like the part at the top? There we go. And then, okay, there we go. I figured it out, and now my keyboard is, okay, intersectionality and identity politics. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at intersectionality. We have the connection of differing, overlapping sources of identity and how it interacts with one's place and treatment in the world. And then we have identity politics, which is a recognitional phrase believed to be first used by the CRC, addressing oppression on the basis of one's identities, being a source of political radicalization. So I highlighted some important quotes down at the bottom here that I think would be important to highlight. So I'll read those out loud to you. So the Combahee women did not coin the phrase intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw did so in 1989. But the CRC did articulate the analysis that animates the meaning of intersectionality, the idea that multiple oppressions reinforce each other to create new categories of suffering. That's on intersectionality. And over here on identity politics, one quote that I'd like to highlight is from an interview that said, "We have a right as people who are not just female, who are not solely Black, who are not just lesbians, who are not just working class or workers, that we are people who embody all of these identities. And we have a right to build and define political theory and practice based upon that reality."
All right. So last but not least, we have Black radical feminism and white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So to begin, Black radical feminism formed as a response to the critique of mainstream liberation movements. Both Robin Kelley and Bell Hooks talk about this in their work. A lot of the actually, I would say the main figures that we look at, Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith later in the presentation, would come to embody this kind of response, which they saw Black liberation movements would uphold patriarchy and reinforce sexism, and the feminist movement often upheld racism and excluded Black women. So they were excluded from both of these movements and practice, both of these movements, which led them to create their kind of own ideology to really explain and define what their experiences were with racism and patriarchy, and kind of identify that for later down the road. Next would be white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. This is a term coined by Bell Hooks. She describes it as the interlocking systems of domination that define our reality. She uses this term. She insists that it must all be used, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, in order to really get to the understanding of what oppression is, and really reinforce the idea that all of these structures are connected, and make sure that we are not just we don't center white people, but we center the oppressed when talking about people who are being oppressed. And specifically, she states that Black people and their experiences should be at the center of their analysis and not the oppressors.
So now we're going to, in order to sort of make sense of how these concepts fit into the actual movements themselves, we're going to deliver some historical context and some background on how these emerged from, sort of. So in the 1960s, Stonewall and the impact of the Stonewall riots had two sort of dual effects on a lot of organizing in the gay movement. One is the liberating, what we categorize as liberating. It was in the sort of immediate impact of people identifying with a liberation struggle. We saw the founding of the Gay Liberation Front, and people who were immediately sort of organizing within those lines. The gay liberation movement's general sudden emergence, as opposed to the heavily more, I would say, assimilationist attitudes previously of to try and assimilate gay people into mainstream society. And that kind of brings us into the second part, which was the revelatory. Now, if you'll see the picture on the right, this was a sign that the Mattachine Society, a famous so-called homophile organization, had put up in the Stonewall Inn, I believe, a day after the Stonewall riots. And what is essentially is a call for we homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct in the streets of the village. They are telling queer people of Greenwich Village not to riot or not to react violently. Now, the Mattachine Society had been relatively conservative amongst gay organizing groups for a while, but this kind of shows the attitude and the limits of it of assimilationism, in the place of radical possibilities opening themselves. These are organizers telling people to hold back, to try to plead their case peacefully with mainstream society and with the powers that be. You can go to the next slide. The problem with this idea, with this idea of homonormativity, of queer people acting, trying to assimilate into polite society, is that not everyone can assimilate. The privilege of assimilation, of entering society and blending in homogeneously, is that it's only afforded to the blatantly whitest and most digestible forms of identity that the mainstream society is willing to compete with. Uh, I have a quote from Elena Kiesling. Such politics lead to an understanding of queerness as white identity rather than critical of the hegemony of whiteness, because queerness has to clearly position itself as worthy of integrating into normative society rather than being eccentric to it. So, as opposed to doing what Bell Hooks was talking about with combining our systems as white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, it is purely zeroing in on the ways that white people experience homophobia, and sort of on jettisoning the entire all the other aspects in which homophobia is tied into oppression. Uh, so from there, we have to ask the question: what is the Black radical tradition's response to this politic? What is the alternative? I suppose.
All right, and the last bit of historical context that we have is the HIV/AIDS crisis. HIV is a virus that attacks the immune system, and it can eventually lead to AIDS. And during this epidemic, Black gay men were disproportionately affected and killed from this disease, mostly due to lack of care from white organizers' parts and lack of education and resources. It also came from racism from the queer community and homophobia from the Black community. Both of those really factored into how this crisis was handled. Um, okay, and organizations that were created to combat this crisis were mostly targeted to white gay men, and funding for these organizations were severely lacking. Um, the Black community did come together to support and try to come up with solutions. Like, for example, in 1986, the Southern Leadership Conference organized a informational meeting called AIDS in the Black Community. However, they didn't have a Black gay speaker, and they didn't realize that that was anything wrong until an activist kind of pointed it out, saying, hey, if you're going to talk about AIDS in the Black community, you need to have it from somebody who is actually in the community and is really impacted by this. Because if you're going to have a conversation about how Black gay men are being killed at a disproportionate rate, then it should be targeted for Black gay men. In a national way, the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention tried to mobilize like Black elites to help Black gay men, but it was mediocre at best. What really helped was the Black gay community themselves. They had to help themselves and provide resources for themselves. And one way that they did that was through art and history and like alternative sources of media, like poetry, and returning back to African traditions of African gay history. So next we'll start the analysis. We will look over two main figures that we found while doing this research that really stood out to us. And then we will go over the literature that was used in the Black gay liberation movement and inspired this research presentation. So first we have Audre Lorde. She is a lesbian. She is a poet. She is a Black woman. She is a mother. She has a lot of different identities, but one of the most known is her being a Black lesbian poet. She wrote lots of poetry and books that connect both Blackness and queerness. One of those being Cables to Rage. Additionally, she started a publishing group called the Kitchen Table Press with another one of our figures, Barbara Smith, and this group published sources of kind of like a call to action to really mobilize Black queer people and kind of and also provide resources for them as well.
Okay, so can you guys still hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So next we're going to move on to Barbara Smith. So Barbara Smith graduated from Mount Holyoke. I don't know if it's Holyoke or Holyoke College in 1969. And she became interested in Black feminism and the liberation movement in the early 1970s during a bus ride back up to Mount Holyoke in a group conversation. They were headed up there, I believe, for a protest. And there was a white woman going on about feminism and the liberation movement, and she expressed her surprise for why a white woman was gun-hoing this conversation. And then following her graduation, she sought to become a stewardess, but when she wasn't given the chance for career advancement, she said, "Never mind, I'm just gonna go get my graduation degree and my graduate." And so she pursued her master's at the University of Pittsburgh. It was during her time at the University of Pittsburgh and further on when she would become the co-founder of the River Collective and the Kitchen Table with Audre Lorde.
So now we were going to look at the literature and alternative sources of media that showed how different ways Black queer activists were able to communicate and navigate the ever-evolving social movements of the time, whether that being going back and forth between the Black liberation movement and the queer liberation movement, or calling to arms the Black queer liberation movement.
So the first one we're going to start with, as highlighted in class, is the Combahee River Collective Statement. So this statement, as we know, was released in 1977 and focused on these four topics below: the genesis of contemporary Black feminism, what they believe, i.e. the specific province of the politics, the problems in organizing Black feminists, including a brief history of the collective, and Black feminist issues in practice. So specifically looking at it through the lens of the Black queer liberation movement is the rejection of lesbian separatism. So lesbian separatism is basically the differentiation between man and woman and their liberation movements. So this statement spoke to how lesbian separatism is not a viable political analysis or strategy because, in their words, it completely denies any but the sexual sources of women's oppression, negating the facts of class and race. And then they go on to say, we struggle together with Black men against racism while we also struggle with Black men about sexism. So we struggle together, but we struggle with. And I definitely wanted to highlight this because it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of identity politics, in terms of intersectionality and things like that. And moving on.
So the next piece we wanted to highlight was Audre Lorde's I Am Your Sister. This was published by her publishing group, the Kitchen Table Press, a collection of Black lesbian writers. This book is, she argues that her identity as a Black lesbian woman is inseparable and is in fact fundamental to Black organizing. And this kind of goes to the point of radical Black feminism, the calling in order for Black women to realize that it's both the patriarchy, and racism and homophobia and all these other oppressors that make this unique experience that Black women face. And you can't separate the fact that she is a lesbian because she is also a Black woman, but she is fundamentally a Black lesbian woman, and you can't take that away from her while she is organizing. Additionally, she goes to say that Black queer people have always been around and are essential to the Black art and Black liberation movement. She talks about Langston Hughes specifically and other artists, but it's kind of her not defending, but explaining that Black queer people have always been here and they will continue to be here. And it is not something new that just showed up. So as Black feminists, as Black women, it is important to accept that. And one way to do that is what she says is liberate your mind of these structures that is holding the community back. And she calls out patriarchy, she calls out capitalism, and she calls out white supremacy. So this kind of all ties in Hook's concept of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy with the fact that you can't have one without the other. And it's always happening all at once, all the time. And the first thing that one can do to organize is to try to decolonize your mind and start new and always be thinking about these influences from the outside that are going to affect you. The next article is a magazine article from Black Magazine. Black Magazine is a news source and way for the Black queer community to organize and promote events, share knowledge, and share art. One of the articles I chose is called Into the Woods. It is about the radical fairy movement in the gay community. The radical fairy movement is about the intersections of queerness and spirituality, and eventually the author talks about how Blackness fits into this movement and how it needs to fit into this movement. So the radical fairy movement, it's about letting go of the patriarchal and heteronormative effect society has almost, and kind of just embracing who you are. And the author talks about one of the ways that this is done is through reclaiming slurs or derogatory terms that were used against queer people. And I think it was really, this article was really reminiscent of Kelly's Radical Imagination. It's about imagining a new world for queer people and building that world for themselves. And this quote right here kind of really speaks to that. We are not straight people and should not presume to be heteronormative in defining ourselves. We are rich in variety and have only to discover and reinvent ourselves in light of who we have been, who we are, and who we will be as a people. So kind of that idea that Kelly draws from, that both the Black community and the Black queer community, they are constantly redefining themselves, and by redefining themselves, they are able to have the space to imagine and the space to be revolutionary, because the act of imagining is revolutionary in and of itself. You can go to the next slide. Okay, I kind of talked about this, but yes, it explores the interconnectedness of spirituality, politics, imagination, and sexuality. A radical revolution in consciousness is fundamental to true and meaningful change, is a quote from the article. And that's really what I feel like Kelly was trying to say in his book. In this sentence from the Into the Woods article really sums it up and draws the connections between how the Black queer liberation movement is, how imagination and space for art and media are essential to having a successful political movement. Additionally, it criticizes, modern democracy and the oppression it creates, and says that Black queer men as Black radical fairies is what they also refer to themselves as, are uniquely situated to understand the intersections of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, basically. Obviously not as well as Black queer women, but as from this perspective in this article, it shows how the best way to understand oppression is through art and imagination. The second article in this magazine is called Black Gay versus Gay Black. It really focuses on the division between the Black community and the queer community, which has been harmful for, the Black liberation movement is having this separation. There's this argument of what is, like, who came first and why does it matter? And the author kind of really delves into this, and first like talking about like interracial relationships and what does that mean for the Black gay community. Like, what does it mean if a Black person is dating a white person in a movement that is so anti-racist, but if they're dating like a white person, what does that mean? And then he kind of talks about internalized racism, not in the terms of like an interracial, not in terms of like an interracial relationship, but like just the internalized racism that can happen, like by you putting these different identities first or last, like being a Black gay versus being a gay Black. And yeah, it talks about homophobia and Black liberation and racism in the queer liberation front. So kind of like all that intersectionality coming back into play. But at the end of the article, I think Jordan, the author, really summarizes it well. While Black gays organize in Black communities, challenge the system's economics, and promote Black autonomy, gay Blacks can push open doors into the world of white power and use Angelo expertise for Black progress. These are two fronts in and two different strategies for winning the Sigma War. So whether or not these the dynamics of these quote unquote two different identities matter, they are both different ways that the community can use to engage in liberation struggles and different ways to promote equality.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about Huey Newton's speech that he did on August 15th, 1970. So for those of you that don't know, Huey Newton was the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. And he gave a speech speaking to the women's liberation movement and the gay liberation movement, specifically to the party's opinion on these movements. So this was kind of like a very, very notable speech because this was one of the first speeches to acknowledge the groups, the shared groups, their shared oppressions. And he also encouraged unification between the three. So following the collective statement, like just associated along with, actually, hold on, the statement was made in 77. Yeah, this was before the statement was made by the River Collective, I believe. But basically, like, just encouraging unification was something that wasn't often seen because there was such internalized homophobia and internalized sexism within the Black liberation movement. So over here, as I'm saying, homosexual was pretty much unacknowledged. And then he further goes on in the speech to reflect on his own insecurities when it comes to homosexuals, which seemed to open a safer space for the LGBTQ community within the movement. So following this is when the River Collective statement came out. And he also calls on the deletion of offensive terms using the F word or the word punk when it comes to referring to the gays within the movement, because once again, he's going back to encouraging unification. He doesn't want to instill hate. So one of the most notable quotes that kind of summarizes what he's talking about here, I state here in the bottom left, remember, we have not established a revolutionary value system. We are only in the process of establishing it. I do not remember our ever constituting any value that said that a revolutionary must say offensive things toward homosexuals, or that a revolutionary should make sure that women do not speak out about their own particular kind of oppression. As a matter of fact, it is just the opposite. We say that we recognize the women's right to be free. We have not said much about the homosexual at all, but we must relate to the homosexual movement because it is a real thing. So he was one of the first in this movement to acknowledge that there were homosexuals within the movement and that what they were going through was real and that they were also being oppressed. And then, as I was saying earlier, he goes deeper into his own insecurities. Over here on the bottom right, he said, we should be willing to discuss the insecurities that many people have about homosexuality. When I say insecurities, I mean the fear that they are some kind of threat to our manhood. He then goes further on to talk about how he finds himself more comfortable with lesbians than with women that love women instead of men that love men. And he talks about why that might be the case, which was really interesting. So if you guys are interested, definitely take a look at this speech. So as I was saying, the speech was just one of the first, Huey Newton's speech was one of the first to acknowledge the fact that homophobia was a problem within the movement. And he was encouraging unification because he's talking about how the liberation movement needed all the allies that it could get. And by instilling this homophobia and this sexism was not helping anybody.
So we kind of have to wrap this together into the main question, which is, so what? What does this mean for the Black radical tradition? How does this all come together? Should we take away from all this information as a whole? And in order to kind of look at that, well, just have to look at this and think of it like this. Black queer movements, as we've been analyzing them so far, are not simply part of Black liberation. They're deeply intertwined. Because for example, because it's the queer liberation tactics and ideas are heavily rooted in the idea of the Black radical tradition of bringing a new world into our current one, of radical transformation, and constantly imagining a new world as we see it. Uh, and while not these Black struggle and the gay struggle are not so much like the same circumstantially, and the Black queer struggle is not the same as the Black heterosexual struggle. These are all intimate struggles, like intimately in dialogue with each other, and all of them impact how we fight forward towards a just future and bring about this new world.
So wrapping up our discussion, while researching, it was quite a broad range, like geography wise, and that brought up the question, like, if we were to continue this research and really focus down on this topic, um, we would want to look at like how regional politics and groups change how we view Black liberation, like specifically rural versus urban areas, and what kind of literature or media publishing sources are provided compared to the other. We thought that would be very interesting to look at, especially because in some rural areas there are not a lot of the same resources available there are in urban ones. And then this is just our works cited, which will be provided, where more will be provided. You know.